Alright, so welcome back to part B of 5.1, and we're going to go through just a couple more of these verification problems. So take a look at the problem in front of you here, right? So back to my analogy that I was using earlier. Just imagine if you were asked to graph, right, by plotting points, the left side of the equation. Well, that'd be fairly troublesome. It would also be fairly troublesome to integrate the left side of the equation, or lots of other operations in math that you might want to do. But just again, now notice, let's assume that you were the student that noticed, wait a minute, I can rewrite this left side of the equation. I can make it look like this. 2 secant of x. This is a whole lot easier to graph. It's a whole lot easier to integrate and so forth, right? So let's begin. Well, we're going to start with the left side. Everything is already in terms of sines and cosines. What we're going to do is we're going to try to, we have 2 fractions, so let's try to combine our 2 fractions into 1 fraction. Right, so I would need an LCD, and in this particular case, the LCD would just be the product of both denominators. So cosine of x multiplied by 1 plus sine of x. Okay, so I have 2 denominators. I want both denominators, right? I want both of these denominators to look like this. I want both of them to be cosine of x times 1 plus sine of x. Okay, so that's not bad. Obviously, let's, and starting with the first fraction, I have the 1 plus sine, right? I'm missing the cosine of x. So here in a second, I'm going to multiply by cosine of x over cosine of x. Likewise, with the second fraction, I have the cosine. I'm missing the 1 plus sine of x. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply by 1 plus sine over 1 plus sine. So let me go ahead. It'll entertain yourself for just a second. It'll take me a second to write all of this. So let's go ahead and multiply this first fraction by cosine of x over cosine of x. And I got 1 plus sine of x divided by cosine of x. And we'll multiply this second fraction by 1 plus sine x over 1 plus sine of x. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the first fraction. So this is going to be fairly easy. When we multiply the numerators, and this is going to be cosine times cosine, so it's going to be cosine squared. And I'm going to just multiply this as cosine times 1 plus sine. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So that's going to be cosine squared over 1 plus, let me write it. So that's going to be cosine of x times 1 plus sine of x. Okay, so we're done with the first fraction. Let's go ahead and move to the second fraction. So I'm going to start with the denominator, because the denominator we know is just going to be cosine of x times 1 plus sine of x. All right, so done with the denominator. Now, what I want to make sure that you see, let's look at these numerators here. Do you see that you're going to be foiling? That's my real question. Do you see that? So let me put some parentheses here to help you in case you don't see it. Right, so this is just gonna be, first, outer, inner, last. We're gonna FOIL the numerators in that second fraction. I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now. So 1 times 1 is 1, and then 1 times sine plus 1 times sine, so that's going to be, I want to make sure I don't want to skip a step, and I don't want you to get confused. Does it make sense to you that 1 times sine is just sine, and then sine times 1 is just sine. So you're going to have, when you combine them, you'll have 2 sine of x. And that last step, if you take sine of x times sine of x, you just have sine squared x. Okay, so the foiling part is done, and we finally, now that we have common denominators, we can finally add our 2 fractions. So let me go ahead and do that right now. So we know that the denominator is going to be cosine of x times 1 plus sine of x. And let me just go ahead and write it out. So cosine squared plus 1 plus 2 sine of x plus sine squared x. All right, more advanced question for you, for those out there that are like, man, this is just easy. I got this. Okay, here in a second, I'm gonna, in the next step, let me go ahead and let me do this for you, just a second. So here's what I'm actually going to have when the more advanced question is, so take a look at this numerator, and I'm going to give you just a second to contemplate, right, to reflect. How did I go from this numerator to what I'm about to write next? Interesting. How? Don't worry, I'll tell you, but just take a second. How did I go from the above step to where I'm at right now? Okay. So in case you don't spot it, and it's okay if you don't spot it, right? All you need is just practice. So here's what's going to happen. Do you recall from a previous problem that anytime you have cosine squared plus sine squared, right, or sine squared plus cosine squared, do you remember what that's equal to? Yeah, cosine squared plus sine squared is just equal to 1. So what I have highlighted right now, these 2 boxes are going to turn into 1, right? Because this cosine squared plus sine squared is going to turn into just 1. And that's why if you have 1, that if those 2 turn into 1, I have 1 plus 1, that's 2, plus 2 sine of x. I hope you see how I got to this step. So one more time, these guys are going to cancel, and what you're left with is just 1. So it's 1 plus 2 sine of x. That's how I got to here. All right, let's make sure we understand this. This still does not look like 2 secant of x, so obviously we're not done. All right, well, what else should we do? Because it's right now, it's easy to start second guessing ourselves, thinking we did something wrong. Well, let's just go back to our strategies. Remember, we're allowed to factor, right? So do you agree with me that I can factor a 2 out of this numerator? Let's just try it. Let's see what that looks like if I factor a 2 out. So that I would be left with 1 plus sine of x. Let me rewrite my denominator. Now you should see it. At this stage, this 1 plus sine of x and this 1 plus sine of x, these are factors, so we can cancel those. So what we would be left with is just 2 over cosine of x. But let's finish it. This still doesn't look like what we were supposed to verify, right? But remember, secant, if you look at your formula sheet, secant x is just 1 over cosine of x. So 2 over cosine of x would just be what? It would be 2 secant. And we're fully verified. All right. Last problem, and then you'll get the rest of your practice from your homework. All right. So in this case, this is actually a very good problem. This is one that I can see myself getting stuck when I was first learning this material. So, all right. Remember, we normally choose the busier or more complicated side, but it doesn't really matter in this case. I'm going to choose the left side. I'm going to see if I can make the left side look like the right side. So let me start with what I have. Right now I have sine of x over 1 plus cosine of x. And let's think back to some of our strategies. So we've chosen the more complicated side. Everything is already in terms of sines and cosines, so we don't have that step to do. There's no way to factor. All right, there's nothing we can factor. There is nothing to multiply. In fact, do you understand? This is very important in case you don't have your background in kind of some of the lower maths is lacking. Does it make sense that you cannot break this up into two fractions? Right? It won't work. If you have, it's very important that you understand. This can be broken up into two fractions. What I'm circling now, right? This could be 1 over sine of x minus cosine of x over sine of x. When you have two terms in your numerator, you can break that up into two fractions. That doesn't work here. You cannot break this up into two fractions. So what do we do? So at least not two helpful fractions, I should say. What do we do? Well, let's go back to our strategy page. Let me add one more technique that you can use. Let's think of this as when all else fails. What you can try to do is rationalize. Right? Rationalize the denominator, numerator. Just understand that rationalizing is a tool that you have at your disposal. So what we're going to do is we're going to rationalize the denominator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply this fraction by the conjugate of this denominator. So the conjugate of 1 plus cosine of x is just 1 minus cosine of x. The conjugate of, in other words, the conjugate of a plus b is just a minus b. The conjugate of a minus b is just a plus b. So let's multiply by the conjugate. So the conjugate would be 1 minus cosine of x, and if I multiply the numerator by 1 minus cosine of x, I have to be willing to multiply, the denominator, I have to also be willing to multiply the numerator by 1 minus cosine of x. All right, so this might look complicated, but don't you agree with me that 1 minus cosine over 1 minus cosine is just 1? So this is, again, just a fancy way of writing times 1. All right, well, let's see what this looks like. So let's go ahead and multiply the numerator. So that's going to be sine of x multiplied by 1 minus cosine of x. And it's my hopes that you see that you're going to be foiling. Right, you're going to be foiling the denominator, so it's going to be 1 times 1, 1 times negative cosine, cosine times 1, cosine times negative cosine. So let's go ahead and FOIL this out. All right? Okay, so in this case, 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times negative cosine is going to be negative cosine of x. Cosine times 1 is going to be positive cosine of x. And finally, let me kind of make my fraction bar a little bit longer. And finally, positive cosine multiplied by negative cosine is going to be negative cosine squared x. All right. So at this stage, do you see that this cosine is going to cancel this cosine, right? Negative cosine plus cosine cancel. In fact, that's always going to happen. Anytime you multiply by its conjugate, these two middle terms are always going to cancel like this. But let's go ahead and write what would be left. So we would have sine of x times 1 minus cosine of x. And then after we cancel everything out, we would have what we would have left is 1 minus cosine squared x. Okay. So sometimes, and we're almost done, so sometimes it's helpful when you feel like you're not getting it right? When you feel like you're doing something wrong, it's helpful just to take a look at where you're trying to go. So let's make sure we understand that this 1 minus cosine squared, we can rewrite that. If you look at your formula sheet, 1 minus cosine squared is equal to sine squared. So let's see what it looks like after we change that. Okay. Well, at this stage, do you spot that this sine of x can cancel one of these, right? So you would have, after I'll go ahead and show that they're gonna cancel out, and what you would be left with is 1 minus cosine of x over sine of x, which is exactly where you want it to be. So you have fully verified the problem. Okay, so I hope that these problems have at least have helped a little bit. The next few sections that we're going to go into are fairly straightforward, fairly easy. If you ask me if you ask me what should I really be taking out of this class into calculus, from at least from chapter 5, it's going to be 5.1 and 5.5. These are the two main sections that you want to be good at before you leave this class to make calculus easier. Other than that, I'll see you in the next video.